So in our last episode, we actually put the camshaft in our Mighty Mouse project block. Stay tuned and we'll talk about the crankshaft. Hi, welcome back to In the Garage. If you remember in our last episode, we actually put the camshaft into our Chevy Small Block. So in this episode, we're going to test fit and check clearances on our crankshaft before we get it installed. So the first thing we need to do is make sure everything is absolutely clean and dry. We don't want any oil, any assembly lube residue on it. We want to make sure everything's clean and dry so that we get a good accurate reading on our clearances. So what I've already done is I've gone through and I've cleaned all of the journals for the crankshaft bearings. We're going to go ahead and install a few bearings now, show you how that goes. But again, remember this is a clearance fit, so we're not going to put any lube or assembly lube or oil or anything on it because we want a nice dry fit to get a good accurate reading. So stay tuned and we'll show you how to do that. So once you've got all the journals cleaned and dried and made sure everything's straight there, you're going to want to do the same with the actual crank bearings. Now with our crank, we're actually using a 4340 forged crank, so we're using a special radius bearing set. Make sure that your bearing set matches up with the crank that you're putting in your engine. With the 4340 crankshaft, the bearing has a chamfered piece to give extra clearance for the extra material that's in our crank. That's the reason we're using these special radius bearings. But I've cleaned most of them out. We'll come back in just a second and I'll show you how they actually install in the journals. So the first set you're going to install is the actual upper bearings. Now it sounds wrong because obviously everything looks like this is the lower, but remember our block is actually flipped over at this point. And they only go in one way. It is specific to a direction. One way to denote the upper bearings is they actually do have a hole in them for the oil channeling for the crankshaft. But you'll see if you look really close there that it does actually have a tab on one side of the bearing itself. And you'll notice that there's a machine piece on the journal itself that tab rod lays into. So you line those up and then you just push in the bearing. You're going to want to make sure that the holes are lined up with the oil journal at the bottom as well. You can see we've got the rest of them installed. Now remember, this is a dry fit, so we're not oiling or lubing anything yet because we're going to lay the crankshaft in there and just check our clearances in this before we take everything out, lube it up, and then do the final install of everything. So once we've got the upper bearing set in, it's time to lay the crankshaft in. Now just like we did with the camshaft, we want to make sure the crank is good and clean because it does have some machining oil on it to preserve it while it's in storage. So we made sure to clean everything, scrub it with a plastic brush, and wipe it down with some paper towels before we put it into our block because we want to make sure we have an absolutely clean crankshaft before it goes in. Again, to make sure that we get the best clearance readings we can. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the block over here and lay it in there. We'll be right back. So I've gone ahead and laid it in here, but a good thing to keep in mind is to grab it by the ends because you want to lay it into the journals as evenly as you can to make sure that everything lines up and you're not kinking or pressing in on the bearings in an odd way. Make sure it lays in flat. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off all the tops where we're going to lay our Plastigauge in, and we'll button up some main caps and check our clearances. One quick point I want to make about this part of the process is, again, remember this is a dry fit test for clearances, so we don't have any oil or any lube on any parts that are in contact right now, so you're going to want to keep from twisting and spinning this crank any more than you have to since the bearings are completely dry. Again, let me make one point. The crankshaft that we're actually using is a 4340 forged from Howard's Cans. It's a great piece. It's a standard setup for what we're using. It's going to be great for our block, for our test block. But make sure again you get the right bearings to work with this material, and make sure again, since you're doing a dry clearance, that you're actually not twisting and spinning stuff any more than you have to. Okay, so we've got all the main caps put in and our bolts are snug down just finger tight. There is a torque series that you want to follow, and if you don't know it, make sure that you get with whatever engine you're building what the torque pattern and specs are for that. Now, ours is actually to finish up on 70, so we're doing it in thirds. So we're starting at 35, then we'll do it at 50, and then we'll do it at 70. So we're going the whole process 3 times to make sure we don't bind anything up. So the series, if you want to come over here real close, I'll show you the series on the bolts to make sure. Now this is for our Chevy Small Block, so whatever block you're building, it may have a different torquing pattern. So make sure you check the specs from the manufacturer. But on ours, we start in the center and work all the centers, and then we come back out and do the outers for this 4-bolt main setup. It'll go from the 3rd main cap, 1, 2, to the 4th main cap, 3, 4, to the 2nd main cap, 5, 6, to the back, 7, 8, to the front, 9, 10. Then we go back to the 3rd main cap, 11, 12, 4th, 13, 14, 2nd, 15, 16. And like I said, we'll do that down to 35 foot-pounds. Then we'll come back, we'll do the whole thing at 50 foot-pounds. Then we'll come back for the finished piece of doing everything down to 70. Now, a lot of people will do 70 and 70 on a 4-bolt main, but just as a personal preference, we do it at 70 pounds for the center, and then for the outer bolts, we do it at 65. Because sometimes you can bind up and actually bow that cap, and it can affect the performance of the engine. So let's do that real quick, and we'll be back.